This is the One Piece of Advice podcast with your host, you already know, Jaya Milton. And I got an amazing friend with me. This guy has been a blessing in disguise. And we've kept in touch for years because we met at a performance that I was doing with him and his cousin that came to Deltona. And ever since then, we linked up. We've had Bible studies. We have had lunch. We've been through a lot. And he's the reason where I'm at today, biblically, theologically, just well-rounded. And we go to the same church. But my good buddy, Juan Rodriguez, it is an honor to have the legend with me here, the wretch himself, but redeemed Rodriguez. Here we are. So we'll go ahead. We'll get to cracking. This podcast, we are going to be talking about joy and rejoicing. Two very topical, very important, how should I say, very important topics. Yeah, very important topics. Things that should be on a believer at all times if possible. Sometimes it may feel impossible to always have joy, but the Lord commands us to do so and to rejoice. So we'll just start. Let's define what it means to have joy and to rejoice. Juan, do you have anything that you can share as far as defining what joy is? It could be biblically or even what we think society-wise what joy or rejoice means.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you for that introduction. That's far more than I could ever attain in my own self. Thank the Lord for his grace and his mercy to say all those incredible things you said about me. Joy. I mean, I think joy is mostly always mistaken for happiness. And with the culture and the climate and these times that we're living in, and as far as I can remember, it always seems like the greatest thing as far as an achievement of life is to be happy. You know, aside from, I guess, buying a car or a home, but again, happiness, it's way different than joy. And just to think about, happiness, happenstances, I mean, these are all determined by circumstances that we may either face or maybe going through. But joy is a little different because joy is not limited to any of that. It's not, for one thing, we know that joy is a fruit of the Spirit that comes from having the Spirit in us as believers. And so, I mean, it's not depending on circumstances whatsoever. So regardless of what you may be facing, if you're experiencing true biblical joy, there's really nothing that can shake that. Although there is things that I'm sure we're going to talk about that either could be distractors, maybe we want to say that word, possibly, if we're going to use that. But,
yeah,
something like that we'll be able to determine whether, I know in some of my studies, they call it the thieves of joy. I think John MacArthur kind of targets it with the thieves of joy. And, of course, people are sort of, these are all, I think, what he was always saying, that sort of things that would try to either steal your joy or...
like they suck the joy out of you.
Yes. So I hope that was...
most definitely, yeah. So with that being said, the book of joy, as noted by many throughout church history, the book of joy, the great letter, really not an actual book in itself, but the letter that Paul wrote, which is from in Philippians. We're gonna dig into Philippians, and we're gonna dissect some verses. There's also some verses about rejoicing there too. The same thing with the book of James as well, and we'll dive into those, and we'll kind of give a breakdown on what it means to have joy in the Lord and to rejoice in all things. And so one of those key verses we'll get to. I don't know if you have a verse ready. If not, I have a verse here. But yeah, go ahead. If you got the verse. If not, I got a verse right here.
Yeah, go ahead and share that one. I'm going to go backtrack a little bit from that point.
Okay, perfect. So the verse that kind of stuck out to me the most, which highlights the whole joy conversation, is Philippians 3:1. And so let me pull that out real quick. Yeah, so with thanksgiving and prayer, as mentioned in Philippians chapter 1, where it says, verse 3, I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine for you, all making my prayer with joy. Other verses also point that out, like in the book of James. And in James, it says in verse 2 from chapter 1 to count it all joy. And so we could kind of see Paul and James highlighting things of joy, having joy and rejoicing. Philippians 3:1 says to also rejoice in the Lord. I remember there was a song way back when, and it was like, rejoice in the Lord always. I think of that song as when I'm reading through it.
Joyous.
Yeah, it is a joyful song. Get a shout of praise, one of those.
I'm smiling just thinking
Yeah,
about it.
it's like, I remember it as clear as day when I first heard that song, and it truly is a joyous song in itself. Very jolly. But beyond that scope musically, biblically, the joy of the Lord, it would be the very comforting to know that it's a fruit of the Spirit, and with those fruits, joy is one of those fruits, and every believer should have joy. There's no way to be a Christian without joy. Why do we have joy, though? Why do we experience this emotion that not only comes humanly, but comes spiritually to us? And it's great that you mentioned that being happy is not this end goal of attaining accolades and being happy because of circumstances. It's beyond the scope of happiness. You can pursue happiness all you want. You won't even have joy at the end. It's a fleeting emotion that only comes primarily humanly, whereas joy, since it is a fruit of the Spirit, that means that when we are born again, when we become believers, the joy of the Lord comes upon us because, one, we are saved from what? Saved from the wrath of God, from God himself, but because we know that our salvation is found in him, and we will be with him in glory when the day comes. That's a joyous thing to know. It's a great and amazing feeling to know we know where our eternal resting place is when we leave this earth. I'm not just happy about it. I'm rejoicing over the fact that I have found this great salvation, not out of my own doing, that the Lord he found me. I never really found him at all.
Yes, amen.
So it's a great thing to understand, not to seek just the happiness of things. It's okay to be happy. There's nothing wrong being happy. It's just a matter of pursuing this false sense of happiness that just doesn't exist. It's better to be joy. It's better to have joy and to rejoice in all these things, as Philippians and James go back and forth on, than just being happy, where it's always a fleeting emotion that comes in and out.
Yes, absolutely. And just like you mentioned, I mean, it's, that I could be driving down the road and be listening to worship music, or maybe one particular one that, it helps me experience joy, like the one you just said, and all of a sudden I blow a tire, right? I blow a tire and I blow everything that I had in joy, or supposedly happy. I was happy at the moment, right? And next thing you know, I'm not anymore, because the circumstances changed that whole thing. And not only that, now all that I have to endure now, or how long it's just all going to take for me to get this situation over and done with so that I can go back to feeling like I was prior to that happening. Well, when we experience joy, it's regardless of anything like that. It's not dependent on circumstances at all, because that's what James is saying. They count it all joy when we face trials and tribulations of many kinds, but we are commanded to also. And here's another thing. If you are not a born-again believer and you don't have the Spirit of God living and dwelling within you, you will not have joy. You can't experience joy, unfortunately. But you have the opportunity, even if you're listening to this podcast right now, to know that me and Jaya here are not only men of God, we're born again. We do experience what that joy is because it's a fruit of the Spirit that dwells within us. And that's a major difference between somebody who not only says they're happy based on circumstances or are experiencing happiness for a moment. But we look to that, not only that, but we're commanded to have joy no matter what circumstances we face.
So that's actually what I want to get into. How do we find joy in those circumstances that kind of hit us when we're not looking? That blown tire, or your house you go bankrupt, or there's a foreclosure, you're getting evicted, and things like that. How do we find joy in the things that cause us the most pain? Is there some sort of biblical, God tells us to have it, but how do we obtain it outside of our normal means, I guess you can say, because it doesn't come from within us. It's something that the Lord gives. But how do I find, it could be a 20-year Christian, and then one bad thing happens and all of a sudden they don't have joy or something? Or like, can you kind of maybe like steer around that?
Yes. Well, what I actually wanted to, I want to share some scriptures to go right back to, Paul's writing this letter, basically that was coming from, I forget the guy's, if it was Epaphroditus who sent the letter to him. Who was the guy's name? Do you remember?
I think it was Epaphroditus.
Yeah. So I have to go back to the beginning there.
We'll find it.
Yeah. And so he's basically, it's a letter of thanks, but Paul eventually sends him back and he says, well, thank you and everything. But you got to look at the Philippian church. It was birthed out of joy. And so just thinking about Acts 16, this was the first European church that basically was started. And if you look through the whole Acts chapter 16, there's one of the stories that I share with the guys at the prison and in the jails in my ministry. And I always kind of share this backstory because this was the conversion of the Philippian jailer. I always kind of say the correctional officer, right? That got saved. And I've actually had experienced that doing prison ministry. We're not just there for the inmates. We're there for all staff, whether it be medical, whether it be the officers there on duty. We're there representing the Lord, and we're ready to reach out to any one of them. I think most times people get that persona where, we're focusing on, the inmates, trying to get people who are breaking the law saved. It's far more greater than that, far more greater than we could ever ask or think anyway. When we're being used by God to do his work, you really just don't know what's going to happen. So, for the most part, you got to say yes, right? And you got to go. That's more of a mission statement that most missionaries throw out there. Even when churches send people out, I've actually had that opportunity to in the past to go out of the country and minister God's word, in a foreign land, and that was incredible there. But thinking about the conversion of the Philippian jailer, if I can read a few scriptures,
go for it.
Not to take too much time. So we're in Acts chapter 16, verse 25. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. And the prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken. And immediately all the doors were opened, and everyone's bonds were unfastened. When the jailer woke and saw that the prison doors were open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself. Supposing that the doors were open, prisoners had escaped. But Paul cried out with a loud voice, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." And the jailer called for the lights and rushed in. And trembling with fear, he fell down before Paul and Silas. Then he brought them out and said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" And they said, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." And they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all who were in his house. And he took them the same hour of the night and washed their wounds, and he was baptized at once, he and all his family. That's pretty amazing. Then he brought them up into his house and set food before them, and he rejoiced. Rejoice. This is the birth of this exact epistle that we're sort of highlighting today, and on this topic of joy. He rejoiced. Okay? That's pretty awesome. Along with his entire household, that he had believed in God. There's a lot there. That's a whole set of great words from God here, shared by Luke when he's writing the book of Acts. And this is incredible because Luke was a companion of Paul.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, and his mission journeys. And I believe that this mission journey, I think, was the second missionary journey. And I wish I'd had that chart in front of me, and I do have it somewhere. And this was the experience there. And then that's just the conversion of the Philippian jailer. There's also the conversion of Lydia, which is, she was a wealthy woman. Basically, this is how the Philippian church was founded.
Okay.
And that's another really known or highlighted person, and let's just say first members of the Philippian church. But it was a woman. So, and it was crazy because we will have to go back into the chapter to kind of get there, but I believe there was three. I think the Philippian jailer was one. Lydia was another one. And I can't remember if there was a third one. I thought it was, and it still could be. I just don't know which one.
I remember years ago when we did the study of the book of Philippians, we did about 16 weeks.
Yes.
Like 13 to 16 weeks, and we were going through the entire book.
Yes, which is only 4 chapters.
Yeah, but that thing took months.
One letter.
Yeah.
One letter. One love letter, basically. Yeah. Full of joy.
And that's it.
Yeah.
That's insane.
And I mean, even those two, let's just say the first chapter and the 4th chapter, they're pretty much like an introduction and a salutation, and then really the body's like within 2 chapters, which there really wasn't any chapters, right? Just wrote this letter. But yeah, that's amazing, because when I look about, when I think about that, how it was actually started on joy. And here we are, I believe, 20 years later, the Philippian church is well established in Philippi, which is a Roman colony. And I mean, even when we start digging into the actual letter of the Philippian letter that we're going into right now, you can see so much more that we could highlight, but I don't want to get too ahead.
Yeah, no, that's good stuff, man. Super, super good stuff. There's so much to. We literally cannot unpack the 16 weeks that we spent in just 30 minutes to 60 minutes. It'd be impossible. But what we can say is how vital it is to have joy, to rejoice in all things, despite the circumstances. It has nothing to do with circumstance. It has everything to do with what the Lord is providing, putting in your heart, mind, and spirit. And just as Juan said, as Paul's writing this letter, while he's in jail, he's imprisoned by the emperor, correct? It was the emperor?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the most beautiful thing is that by the end of it, doesn't the emperor get saved at the end?
Absolutely, yes.
That's insane. He was placed there by Roman authorities.
Yes.
And not only was he able to break free from his shackles after writing this letter, the angel of the Lord shook everything up, and their shackles were unfastened, and the jailer gets saved, and then later the same head of authority gets saved in the process. And then Paul actually says it here in the verse. Let me find the verse in Philippians 1:12. The reason why Paul was so excited is that he saw this as an opportunity to advance the gospel. He was never upset being in jail. He was debating between the two things. I want to go with Christ so badly, but if I must be on earth, I'm going to do what I need to do for Christ then. He's like, I find joy in both things.
Yes.
And he never found an issue because he always was gospel oriented. He had a mission. He knew what he was put on earth to do by Christ himself on the road to Damascus. That's Acts 9. We see these things happening, and Paul's rejoicing in these things. He probably, before he was a born-again believer, he probably would have never has seen these things as the advancement of the gospel. He probably would have saw these things as rubbish, as he would say in his own words. He has all these things as a Hebrew of Hebrews, or he was a scholar. He says all these things that he has, he says he considers them all rubbish. All these, what we would consider accolades and titles and such, it meant nothing to him. He just wanted to have the joy of the Lord. He wanted to rejoice in all things despite circumstances, because I'm sure it wasn't a happy place where he was at. I'm sure it was probably one of the roughest jails you could probably think of, being under a very live Roman Empire.
Yes. Yeah, and consider, just to consider his direct circumstances, the studies that were made to kind of give you a better picture of what it was actually like in there. So, he was basically chained to a Roman soldier at all times.
Okay, I forgot.
And they would change shifts, and I think they maybe every 6 hours or something like that. So maybe within 2 or 3 different soldiers, he would have to be chained to at any given moment, 24 hours a day. Now, in this particular jail time, it was like a rented home. So he wasn't like he was in Acts, in sort of that really deep dungeon down in there, and those, forget exactly what those shackles
like
were.
the ones on the wall.
Yeah. Again, yeah. And that this was a little different circumstances that he was in now. Again, he's been to jail many times, right? If I could say it in our language.
Yeah,
right?
in layman's terms, yeah.
This is just another bid that he did, And here it is. Think about being chained. I think MacArthur did some of the studies, and Steve Lawson, as far as going back to actually what it would be like. They had maybe, I think, a chain that was possibly a foot long, or maybe a little bit longer.
Yeah, that's not a lot.
Yeah, at any given moment, you're whether you had to use the bathroom, whether you had to take a bath, all these things. And even in the letter of the Philippians, he shares all this because he explains there too, and I will go into it, but he's also explaining his own situation there. That is what it was like. And he rejoiced in the fact that he could, like you were saying, that the gospel going forward. And here's the thing. He had the opportunity to do that. People could actually come in there and visit him, and he could actually continue to share the good news. But here's the thing. These were Praetorian guards. These were like the elites of the emperor's soldiers. This was a different group of soldiers, almost like the Israeli soldiers, right? well known for everything you can imagine. These guys, because Philippi was a Roman colony, when they retired, that was sort of their life. They had this whole different idea there that once they retired, they just have almost like their own state. That's what it was basically like in Philippi. But these Praetorian guards were the same ones who knew very well that Paul did nothing wrong and that he was in there for preaching the gospel. That's not like that wasn't a secret, right? Yeah. If you go to jail and what you're in here for, not that you really just should be discussing what you're in there for, because that's kind of like a rule in there. And I know because I was there. Yeah. I've been there on both sides of the fence. But you're it's not a secret, but for sure the staff knows. Maybe other inmates, between inmates, I can't tell you I'm here for robbery or for this or drug conviction. But no, they knew what Paul was in there for. You can't help, just the whole inner human person, even the worst of the worst has, right? We are made in the image of God. The imago Dei is there.
Yes.
Period. Right? Even the worst of the worst. They knew, and maybe any inclinations whatsoever to say, man, this guy.
How's it going, guys? I want to thank you guys for tuning in to part 1 of the series of Joy and Rejoicing with Juan from S4C Ministries, Soldiers for Christ Ministries. So I want to thank you guys again, and there will be part 2 next week. Until then, enjoy part 1. Thank you.